Welcome, everyone, to In the Hot Seat. It's another episode in our go-to-market series, the evolution of inside sales, new rules for an AI age. For our repeat viewers, thanks for joining us again. If you're new to the show, every 2 weeks we put industry experts and our customers in the hot seat for what we hope is a lively discussion, debate, maybe even a little discourse as we humanize the digital experience. All aspects of the customer life cycle are up for discussion, as well as the technologies used throughout each phase of the journey. So, Pete, I found a couple of things I wanted to run by you. So before we jump into
Please.
the guests, so Salesforce does a big survey every year, the state of sales, and last year they put some numbers out that I thought were really interesting as we were kind of thinking about this in the context of AI and doing some research around AI, SDR, BDR, that sort of thing. So 81% of sales teams are investing in AI. About half are experimenting and the other half are fully in production, which surprised me a little. 83% of sales teams with AI saw revenue growth in the past year versus 66% without AI. Top three areas AI were improving was data quality, accuracy, understanding customer needs, and personalization for customers. And then AI using sales teams said they were 1.4x more likely to increase headcount over the past year. So 83% of sales reps using AI agents for lead generation witnessed tangible success compared to those who did not. So what do you think about those numbers? I mean, pretty impressive numbers.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, how could you make an argument for less intelligence? Like, well, this is going to be more intelligent way of doing it. This is, like,
I'm not going to answer that at all in the context of sales, Pete.
Right. We couldn't get much lower, right? Well,
yeah, I mean,
yeah. Okay. All right.
Well, I mean, it is interesting though, because because they were saying that AI SDRs in particular, this I thought was, is an area that I know a lot of people are experimenting with, but they gave some pretty good numbers: 3x faster prospect qualification, 65% reduction in response time, 40% increase in meeting conversion rates, and consistent 24/7 operations without burnout.
So I've if you look at my LinkedIn page, you'll see all these chicken articles. And I came up with this. I was trying to come up with this way of encapsulating the idea that salespeople tend to go to meetings, and wing it. They're sort of free range salespeople, and they're not systematized in a way that is focused on understanding the customer and and thereby giving themselves the information to create more value. And so I think that's what you're talking about here is a more systematized way of doing, basically asking the right questions so that you can get to, increase conversion rates or increase success or increase value add.
Right.
And it just seems sort of inevitable. Like, how could you argue against doing that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's some interesting statistics there, but one of the areas that I was a little bit surprised about, because you and I have talked about, the human element and how understanding the needs of the prospect is number one, and what does that take? It takes, interaction and that sort of thing. But one of the three areas they talked about improving was understanding customer needs.
Yeah, well, it's amazing how much better you can do that if you ask the right question. Right.
Well, I suppose that's true.
I think the value add of AI in the whole sales space is doing those. It's like the complexity of asking the right question at the right time is something that a machine can do and salespeople can do, but they need years and years and years to ramp up to the point where they can do that in this context, right? And even so, I mean, computers have unlimited memory and salespeople don't. And so that's understanding the customer is, the Brevet group did a study 2 or 3 years ago that said only 13% of buyers feel or believe that sales reps understand their needs. So we've had 30 years of CRM and we're at 13%, in terms of, so anyway, there's plenty of room for improvement still there. And I'm glad to see it starting to happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously it's a point of contention around data quality and really gaining that understanding. And I know, like you said, we've talked about that a lot, but why don't we bring our guest in? Pete, you want to do an intro? I'm really excited to get into this a little bit more.
Sure. So our guest today is Rob Ciampa. He's the CEO and founder of Business Catalytics, which is an analytics and advisory firm leveraging Rob's own proprietary AI diagnostics platform that he built to uncover, measure, and eliminate barriers to business acceleration and growth. Rob's a seasoned VP of Sales and Chief Marketing Officer, and he has re-engineered many sales organizations over the last 25 years. And he's my go-to guy when I'm looking for somebody who is who can bridge both sales and marketing. So let's bring on Rob.
Sure, there we go. Welcome, Rob.
Hey, gentlemen, and what a glorious intro! Thank you very much for having me today.
I'm glad that didn't spin out of control.
It never does. It never does. We're usually in sync, as you said.
You know too much about the guest, anything can happen. So
it does.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, one thing I want, just before we start, Mike, one thing I wanted to just put out there as sort of a framework is another friend of mine said, there's a really big difference between what salespeople, the salesperson you need for demand generation versus demand fulfillment. And I think that goes into this BDR, SDR thing as well. And it goes into, I think it also is informative in terms of what AI can be applied to. But fulfillment is a no-brainer, obviously. Like these agents are going to be able to do all kinds of stuff in that space. But there's still this space where the AI is not going to do as good a job as a human. So anyway, with just that as a backdrop, we'll start zinging you with questions. And
please
see where all this goes.
Well, so why don't we start with a broader question and kind of narrow this down a bit? But, over the past decade, we've seen the inside sales role change, and now with all the talk of AI, maybe changing even more. So what are the biggest challenges that SDRs, BDRs face in companies today?
Yeah, great question, Michael. I think we have to look at some of the macro characteristics about the roles. And starting off, what I see with a lot of firms, and I analyze companies looking specifically for sales performance issues and for marketing performance issues. And when Pete calls me up, he says, "Oh, so-and-so, great sales guy, just lost his job. He lasted a year." I said, "Well, it's probably deeper than that." And a lot of organizations will say, "Oh, we're not hitting our number. It must be the sales guy. It must be inside sales." But if we look at inside sales these days, one of the things that we saw several years ago when we brought in, and we're going to talk about SDRs, BDRs, I'm starting to hear the term XDR, and now we have CDRs for the follow-on business, add your R here. But one trend that we've seen is much less experienced people coming in. Okay, so a couple of years ago, you had probably people with 2 to 3 years of experience, coming in, and because of market conditions and things like that, you're suddenly dealing with a workforce that maybe has a year of experience, and oftentimes it's not relevant. So that's a macro trend there. Even before we get to AI, we're dealing with a different, just a different set of folks. Some of the older issues still persist, inbound, outbound, and we'll talk about that. But one of the things we're seeing today suddenly is, and we talked about it before the call, the age-old things. I see two macro things jumping out as well. One is that the actual management hasn't improved. In fact, a lot of the organizations I go into, the management of the BDR, SDR inside sales function is actually not great. And if I'm offending people that are listening, I'm sorry, but this is an observation, and I'm just scratching my head. Maybe because they can't attract the right people in those management roles. And the other piece, and it somewhat goes hand in hand with what I just said, that enablement sucks, and very few. This is like enablement is a thing that works.
Yeah.
Okay. We proved it works. And I was with one organization about 2 weeks ago. It's like, yeah, we don't want to invest in that. It's like, this is your most important thing.
Right.
And enablement is just something that goes on and on. So we see these are some of the things that are exacerbating some of the performance issues.
We'd
And I know
rather
you
just go to the 1 yard line.
Yeah, exactly. And at the beginning, sure, you shared a lot of happy stats,
Right.
and maybe because I'm dealing with the less happy firms,
Right.
that, I'm seeing some of the broader issues. But we've got that going on, and also we talk about AI. We talk about AI from the perspective, and we'll get into it later.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of those of us who sell, let's not forget those of us we're selling to also have access to AI, and they've done their homework. They're a lot smarter than they used to be. So, that's the macro challenge. So I think organizations are suddenly realizing, can these tools make me better? What can I do? How do I integrate them? And how do we make it more effective?
I do. For years, I did a survey about, how buyers buy, which has been an interesting, evolution over 10, 15 years that I've been doing this. But one, and G2 took that over once I left there, and one of their latest.
IDC.
Huh?
You did this at IDC.
I first did it at IDC. That's correct. But G2 took it over once I left. So, but the question that I love, and this is fairly consistent through the whole survey, was, when do you contact a vendor salesperson? And somewhere between 60-70%, last time it was 68%, said after they've decided what they're going to buy.
I mean, that's just an existential threat to a salesperson, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, talk about fulfillment versus demand generation.
Yeah.
You're not even getting invited to some huge percentage of the fulfillment opportunities, because if your product isn't differentiated enough, or your brand isn't, or whatever, you're not even going to be on the list to get a phone call.
Yeah. And Michael, I can't challenge that, because I happen to agree with it. So it means two things for the sales teams. One, if that's the case and somebody's reached out to you, they're trying to confirm, the decision that they've made, which means it's not you. So you got to think really hard. If you're going to go down this path, you have to have a really, really astute, inside team, or somebody on that inside team who knows how to undo a deal, and it can be done. But it doesn't take your traditional vanilla BDR or SDR rep. That's thing one. Thing two is, obviously, all right, let's change the game. Can we get involved in the conversation before that decision is made? And there's a whole thing. How do we prospect? You hear a lot about intent, intent. And, I almost got thrown out of a room because I challenged several years ago a founder of a major marketing platform who's raving about intent. I said, show me the correlation between intent and closed sales. And he wasn't very happy, because that was his whole shtick. But we have gotten better at intent, and there are certain types of signals that have to be interpreted. So let's get in that conversation earlier. It doesn't mean they have to self-identify. This is important. It doesn't mean they have to self-identify before they show up. There are now tools to basically work around that.
Right. I mean, one of the things that one of the other questions that we asked in that survey was, it eventually led us to figure out over a period of time that when you change this and you talk to people about the fact that the salesperson's bringing them something that's contextual and relevant, when do they want to talk? And the number goes up dramatically, that they want to be contacted by a salesperson when it's contextual and relevant.
Yeah, that is a huge issue. Some people are calling it personalization. And when you say contextual and relevant, it doesn't mean Dear Prospect being converted to Dear Bob. Okay.
Uh-huh.
There's a whole lot more. What do I know about the prospect? One of the things that I don't see is, I had to turn around one organization years ago, and with the inside team, I actually had somebody in the marketing organization spend half of her time doing market intelligence work. And she was looking for specific trends, and she understood industries and who the players were. She looked at announcements. One of the best, she had all her automated searches set up, but she then allowed the inside team to actually reach out with very, very contextual information. I'm not necessarily seeing the AI tools there yet. I think it's going to come. So, but in addition, what do we know about the prospect? Do we have any insight into what they're currently using or what their pain points are? Or, and this is hard, are we witnessing market behaviors with this prospect that would suggest they need us? They've, and just pick up the Wall Street Journal. Half the companies are struggling that are in there. There you go. You got 50 prospects a day.
Well, the problem, and I get a lot of outreach. I'm sure you do too. But the thing that frustrates me is it's back to the contextual and relevance, right? My firm, I have a whole description of it on LinkedIn. It's really easy to see. You can read my bio. You can go to my website. All those things are just right there, right? But how many times do I get outreach that clearly hasn't done even the most basic research? And I don't understand that. I really don't understand that.
That's exactly this sort of fixation by these managers you're talking about that aren't the highest quality on activity levels,
right?
Versus doing the hard work associated with being relevant. How do you create value if you're just winging it every time you get on the phone? I mean, that's.
Yeah. I mean, and you and I've talked about this, and this was something that I observed through the years looking at sales tech tools that have evolved over, the last 15 years or so. And unfortunately, most of those tools are just focused around productivity. How do I let you do more of the thing that's not working? Interesting.
Yeah. So you guys just made me think. So I get these messages all the time. I've written 3 books on digital media with a heavy influence on video, and people will send me a note, not realizing that I've done a ton of video. So I think we need like either a Yelp or a TripAdvisor for stupid outreach. Okay, so and so called me out.
I would love to get. I had a really good one today. Wanted me to attend a monetizing your podcast webinar this week because they could really help me. Because most people who have a podcast only do 3 episodes, and I said, the 80th episode of my podcast goes up next week. I don't think I need it. Thanks.
Yeah, it wastes our time. So I think I'll kind of jump in with, because you raised an issue about productivity. Are people just so busy that they don't want to do the outreach? And remember, we've got the quota hanging over their head in a lot of organizations, especially on the inside. As much as we think, hey, there are great metrics out there for that you can use for your inside reps, but we still deal with like number of calls. Okay.
Right.
Which is honestly a really shitty quota mechanism. So what they want to do is, when they reach out to you, Michael, and they want to sell you stuff you don't need, it's like, hey, it's checking a box. And
well, I realize, I mean, if I have to do 100 calls a day, I'm doing 100 calls a day. If that's what you pay me on, that's what I'm doing.
Exactly.
And if it's 1,000, I'm going to figure out a way to do 1,000, whatever.
Sure.
Yeah, so, it is. I think you're right. I think the metrics are misaligned. Well, you mentioned inbound and outbound a minute ago, and I wanted to kind of throw this in because that's an interesting one. For years we talked about how great inbound was, and it is in the right context. But I'm just curious how, it seems like inbound's less predictable. Outbound, we know, is like way more challenging. So how should organizations think about that balance between inbound, outbound, and how do they find the right mix of SDRs, BDRs to do that kind of work?
Yeah, terrific question. The promise of inbound. It's kind of like the promise of the guys who they want to sell me stuff to help me grow my hair back. Okay. It's a great idea. Look, and ideally, the problem with inbound, if you're gonna go down the inbound approach, you've really got to put a lot of stuff out there that's going to be relevant to them. And then this is where marketing comes in. Is there sufficient content out there that is really gonna make me potentially give my name or my email and make contact with the company. That's the promise of inbound. We have enough stuff out there that's relevant. And then it becomes the issue of gating, and does it work? And the challenge that we have, and we'll spend time equally throwing sales and marketing people under the bus, is that a lot of marketing content sucks. It's basically, and this is where even Gen AI is going to make it even worse. Even if the marketing person says, make this a very compelling, write this in a very compelling way for this particular.
You don't think that prompt will work? Come on.
Yeah, there you go. It'll use better adjectives. But at the end of the day, the stuff just sucks. So when I'm working with firms, it's like, our inbound isn't great, and you look at their content, and it's awful. So it's building the strategy to drive inbound, and it's not just content itself. Are you out there? Is your brand out there? Is your brand showing up where these folks are showing up? You hosting stuff within towns, etc., to drive inbound. And then obviously on the outbound side, what I see continually is, do you have target accounts and target prospects? What do they look like? Again, this is like flossing. You should do it every day. Okay, what are the target accounts? And Pete, you and I have talked about this. Give me a target account list that's relevant and what it means, and the initial contact within the target account shouldn't be the CEO. Thank you very much. So it's really problems on both sides. So once those problems are addressed, then you start looking and assuming that all your sales platforms, your marketing platforms are well instrumented. I have to use the new contemporary word because everything is orchestration now. Okay, so well orchestrated, but we have to have enough insight to see, what does the flow look like? Are we able to turn the levers? And once we realize what we're controlling, and then ultimately looking downstream at conversions, because everything we're talking about here is top of funnel, then we can start saying, this is what the mix is looking like. So a lot of organizations go in, and when I work with companies, I said, just let's do some assumptions around inbound, outbound mix, and then be willing to turn around and address it. But there's a caveat here. Once it's addressed, and once you know what it looks like, a lot of organizations also feel to have workflows that are different for outbound versus, as stupid as it sounds, a lot of firms don't have different processes around outbound versus inbound, which is just stunning.
How do you see how are organizations being run? I mean, do the SDRs and the BDRs report to the same person? Is it in marketing? Is it in sales? What have you seen there? And what should it be?
I have an answer, and I have a number. And then I can give the crappy answer that it depends, which would indicate that I don't know what I'm talking about. But here's how I'll qualify it. I've seen more of a trend over the past 5 years of the XDRs, the BDRs, and the SDRs migrating more to sales. Okay, and I think maybe there's some suspicion about the marketing folks. However, some organizations, and one company that, and if I'll call them out, I look at a lot of companies. I like Sixth Sense, and in their organization, their reps are under marketing. Sam Rashid's the CEO, runs the marketing stuff there. And if you've got a really astute marketing person who can sit on both sides, then if that's the case, it tends to work really well into marketing. But a lot of marketers just don't speak sales. So I'm seeing I'd say about the 3/4 of the organizations I see right now, it's under sales. And that, that doesn't come without a tax, because sometimes it's not getting the oversight that I see when it's in sales. And it's kind of push for the number versus, what can we do to up the quality? So it's a mix.
So so if you've got a sales savvy head of marketing, then the quality, you think, goes up if it's under that person, as opposed to just in a sales organization.
Yeah. Otherwise put on, and that the sales savvy marketing person. Yeah. That's the unicorn that we all look for, Pete.
Okay.
Well, I'm curious about this. So, obviously we're talking about the SDR, BDR teams and the metrics and how they're misaligned and all these other things. But I know in sales, because I've looked at this specifically, the average tenure is like 18 months, takes about 9 months to get them productive, and takes 6 months to find them. So, how much time do you really get out of them? Maybe 9 months, right? But I'm curious, does that carry over to SDR BDRs? Because it seems like their role might even be more volatile.
It's worse. I see between 40 and 50% turnover per year. Which is horrible. Average tenure between 12 and 14 months. And again, you can, even things like enablement or what's expected. And surprisingly, this is where AI ultimately is gonna play a role. And you would think, so what's the frustration point? What people don't realize, those of us who've run BDR and SDR teams, there's just a lot of shit work that's not really on the that's not really dealing with customers. A lot of people can interact, and it's always important hire somebody that has the interpersonal skills, a little bit of empathy. But I see that. Remember, we said it earlier in the podcast. You're dealing with more junior people, but you have to invest in them. And one of the things, there's a rush to get them to productivity. So the average ramp time, by the way, for a rep to productivity is probably about 3 months, depending on. I've seen it as short as like a month and a half, and I've seen it as long as 6 months.
SDR, BDR, we're talking about.
Yeah, ramp time. And we'll talk about the relation of the AEs in a second, in the folks outbound. But a lot of stuff is, in order to track them, the burden is continually put on them to track. Okay, we all know that putting stuff in Salesforce is a pain in the ass. Okay, that's why we invented sales ops. But a lot of the frustration with the inside people, I'm doing mostly administrative work, and it's true. And this is where AI can have a really, really big impact. And if we get rid of the drudgery and we provide more customer engagement, and also using AI to look at some of the feedback, because great people want feedback. And if we analyze conversations using AI, if we get rid of some of the mundane, just generic outreach that's going to be there with AI, suddenly we're giving the SDRs and the BDRs much more stimulating work.
Is there an opportunity for third parties to just take this on, like just outsource this function, or does that not work well?
I always offer to my wife, I said, hey, I don't want to take you out this weekend. Can I hire somebody to take you to dinner? And, you can imagine that's probably not going to go very well. This is a tough one. And I've brought this, always the promise. If you're a small organization, you really don't have the org structure, and it's really, what you've witnessed is that you do have sufficient velocity and stuff can be qualified over the phone, and it's not too complicated, then an outsourcing strategy may work. You get into the more complex sale or the longer sales cycle, it just doesn't. You can't necessarily, and contrary, with all due respect to what the outsourcers say, it doesn't necessarily work well there. I see it better at the lower end, and you got to look at the characteristics. You have to understand your sales cycle. You have to understand your sales velocity. You have to understand your average selling price, and hopefully a comp model that works in order to take a look at, doing something with outsourcing.
Well, so one of the promises, and we saw a little bit in that introduction piece that I'd quoted some of the statistics there and some of the use cases, but so I'm curious, how does that apply when we talk about AI, either from tools that can enable your SDRs, or from a chance of using agentic AI to replace at least some of the work that maybe some of the outbound work that they do?
Yeah, great question. So where let's talk about what I'm seeing now and what I'm starting to see emerge. So what I'm seeing now is even with organizations. So let's go back to our inbound and outbound roles. A great organization is going to have a lot of stuff templatized. That can be within Salesforce or any other type of sales platform that may be complementing Salesforce, or HubSpot as your Salesforce CRM. So that tends to be somewhat abused, and so not used. And if they'll rewrite stuff, and then all of a sudden it's contrary to a marketing campaign that just went out. So with these organizations, if you can turn around and maybe the initial interaction, what I see with some of the savvier reps, And remember, having an SDR, BDR, and an inside sales organization is a great way to vet your future outside salespeople, because a majority of them end up, the ones who are successful, go into sales. A small percentage go into customer success as well, because that kind of plays on it. But what they're doing is they're using Gen AI tools to rewrite that lousy script that they got to make it more personalized. Not a bad idea. Not a bad, and done right, it's great, and it has great effect. And it goes back to the personalization, Michael, that you talked about. Okay, it's a much more personalized approach that can provide context. So we're seeing Gen AI applied to that. Basically, responding to an inbound or doing an outreach. What we're starting to see now are the promise of AI agents. Now, the people selling this stuff, it's like, oh yeah, you get rid of your whole team. Bullshit. Okay. What the AI agent can do, they can do a lot of the initial interaction, and that can be, and the AI agent can be tied to either email response or even a chat bot. A lot of organizations end up using chatbots, and you don't know what's behind it. But chatbots done right can be ridiculously effective in the right industry. So we'll end up seeing elements of that, and that's going to emerge to get rid of some of the frontline drudgery, to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. When it comes to inbounds and things like that, and that's a big deal. But ultimately, the call analysis, companies like Orman are doing it for outbound, determining what's voicemail, what's not. Again, a drive for efficiency. But also, once the call is there, what's happening? Are you analyzing the call? And more importantly, go back, because we were bashing inside sales management earlier, the bad ones only. You're looking at the call logs and analyzing them, and how do I turn this into the enablement, the good feeding loop? And that stuff isn't there yet. And that's AI has the potential to provide insights we've never seen. The question is, do we have the capabilities organizationally to actually take advantage?
Yeah, I often talk to AI different tools, and I was interviewing somebody who co-founded a RevOps AI tool that was really more focused around prescriptive analytics, which I thought is a really interesting place, because it's a support, right? It's not a replacement, but at the same time, it could help you focus your reps in the right direction, so that they are in fact investing time in what has the greatest potential.
Yeah, I mean, there's a flag we have to raise here. I think in tools like this, the potential is amazing. Who's gonna integrate? And this goes back to the problem where we're introducing all these terrific tools, and I host a group called Sales and Marketing Innovators, and we end up, we had Scott Brinker, who does the MarTech report. And there are thousands of companies out there with thousands of integration points. And at the end of the day, how do you get it all? We had a conversation a couple of months ago on a webinar. How do you get it all to work? And even if you get it to work, how do you get it to work effectively? And then if you get it to work effectively, how do you adapt to market conditions? That's a big ask for organizations. So, are we going to use AI to simplify the process? That may be the alternative.
Well, I admit I have some fear that we start to think of agentic AI as the way to get to those quota numbers that we've wanted our people to get to, but they couldn't, because they can't work 24/7. But these AI agents, I mean, they could do outbound 24/7. I don't know.
They can, but there's an interesting, who was doing this? I think it was Sixth Sense that was doing this. They bifurcated the outreach, and they knew at which point to either, let's stick with AI, or let's bring the human element, or let's do both.
Right.
And there's, like I said, there's a lot of experimentation down there. What's going to work? And I think ultimately you got to figure that out. But let's understand, we're also dealing with a frustrated consumer base, because what we talked about earlier, it's people are reaching out to you with no context. You get that call, it's going to be really hard. And I remember when I first ran inside sales, it was about one prospect and 5 to 7 touch points, either phone or email.
Right.
These days, they're doing multi-threading, so you're hitting multiple contacts, but the average number of touches is over 20. So, what's it telling you? It's like, it's telling you that, you may be getting better, but the people you're targeting are just, are frustrated with you and and when they make a decision, they're pretty savvy.
Are there other channels that SDRs, BDRs could be using, BDRs in particular, I guess, to interact with customers that are sort of being underutilized today, that haven't been, bled dry by just the volume?
Yeah. So Pete, can I change one of your words?
Sure.
I'm going to change using to abusing. And I think the one that tends to get abused is LinkedIn. And I was working with one organization, and this firm wanted to take over they said, we want to send LinkedIn, emails on the behalf of a well-known executive in the company. Okay. They started, and you talk about a disaster. He ended up getting flagged. The executive got flagged. So I think LinkedIn done right could be, but LinkedIn tends to get abused. And so when we look at, what are the various channels, because, just the channels of phone and email, is that really enough? And then providing context, there's also the concept of, are there other touch points that they can do? It's like, hey, we're going to be at this particular event. You have to, again, the inside people have to know what's happening in the industry. And sometimes with the inside people, it's like, look, we're going to have a presence here, or we're going to have a happy hour after this specific event. We would like to invite you. Okay. So it's more personal. So the channels, I think a lot of it goes back to the cowardice of a lot of stuff. It's like, get bold, use channels on a more human level, as opposed to just outright technology. So to answer your question, we got phone, we got email, but ultimately it goes beyond some of the other touch points, specifically. And we should mention that sometimes there's a stark line between inside and outside, and that can be bad. If inside and outside are kind of courting the initial deal, that can be very effective.
And do you recommend that SDRs, BDRs are focused on a single industry, or is that too expensive to implement?
Oh, the segmentation. It's going to vary by inbound or outbound. And what I see I can argue either side. And forgive me, I'm just generally not ambivalent on things. So it tends to be by industry, by geography, oftentimes. So what's the territory? I found that the territory mapping is generally, again, it depends on the industry, tends to be a little bit better. Where I've seen some issues is on the and that's good on outbound. What happens on inbound? And then we're dealing with routing logic, and the routing logic has to take into account, are we segmenting our SDRs on the inbound side, based on, what does this look like? Is it based on territory? Is it based on something else? So it's gonna vary. And I've seen, you have to adapt it. You have to segment somehow. I found that the general purpose just doesn't work. So segmentation is key, but it could be by product, it could be by industry, or something else.
Just to cut down that complexity and increase the amount of contextualization you can do.
Yeah, you're going to get a better conversation when somebody has a clue, and that's the whole. That's what it comes down to. Yeah, let's find somebody who has his or her
unraveling that mystery for us.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, it does seem like that it varies greatly by the product too, right? I mean, it depends on the industry, the product, how complex things are. I mean, there must be a lot of variables that really mean you need to individualize your offering based on all of those other factors as well.
This begs a question.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you, but the question we have to answer is, what's the handoff? And to whom is the handoff? If the handoff is relatively early, then you can go a little bit more generic. If the handoff is later, then that's going to be more difficult. And with certain BDR roles that I've seen, some people really want the BDR to hand off when the opportunity is qualified.
Mhm.
Okay. Pete, you and I used to talk about BANT and other signs of buying criteria, or, moving through the funnel, but it depends on where you're choosing to hand off. So begs the question. It's like, okay, which one should we use?
Right.
And, as you look at things, what type of leads is it going to be more inbound? Are you more heavier on the inbound? Then you may want something that's going to be more generic initially. The thing that we haven't talked about is we're assuming that the organization is responsible for its own selling. Okay. If we do any type of tiered selling, if we're selling through a network of reps that we're just part of their portfolio, that raises the other issue. What does the interface look like? Or are the reps themselves, do they have their own teams doing inside sales? And when they bubble stuff up, how do they interface back to you? And these are some of the things, a lot of the inside sales questions, that I see across, people forget that, depending on, you got to look at the business model and the structure of the industry. And that's where I see a lot of inside sales feeling. I had got involved with, got acquired into a Fortune 5. We did a turnaround of a small company, got acquired into a Fortune 500. And the way we actually, we ended up, I inherited a $30 million business that was stagnant for 5 years. And we looked at all the processes and we got rid of all the stuff that just wasn't working. But our biggest investment is we trained the inside sales teams on our sales and distribution channels. And we went, so it was, when they brought us in 30 million years in a row, we ended up doing over 100 million the first year. It was that big an impact. And that was inside sales.
So we are getting close to the end of the episode. Sorry, Pete, didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I there was one question that I really wanted to make sure we got in, and actually I may make it a slightly hybrid question, but best practices. I mean, obviously you've worked with a lot of teams, so I was wondering if you could share, what are some of the common processes, traits, tools that seem to be the most successful, and then underneath that, I was also really curious because we talked about metrics. What are the metrics that work for these teams?
Yeah, they're great question. There are metrics all over the place. So I spend a lot of my time doing the diagnosis, and then we come up with what the solution is going to be, and then I bring in organizations that are more capable than I to actually implement the fix. So the solution part becomes relatively big. So the first thing we have to take a look at is when we're looking at the team, and I mentioned it earlier, low-hanging fruit, who's managing the team? What does the structure look like? You talked about key metrics, is how many, when you look at the manager, how many inside sales reps are they supporting? And I've seen as low as, in complex industries, as low as 2, 1 manager to 2 reps. And I've seen it as high as 10. It's probably going to be around 6 or 7 for your average industry. So that's going to be a relatively key metric. Then with the reps themselves, they're also, depending on how you set up your infrastructure, how many, if they're supporting AEs, and there isn't that wall that gets in the way, how many outside reps can an inside salesperson support? And I've seen similar ratios. It's not as high as you'd think. People say, oh yeah, let's have 1 inside person support 20 sales guys. Isn't that great? Yeah, that's a great. It is great. It's great for failure. So what you got to do is, what does the number look like? And you got to take a look at, ultimately, the balance of what they're contributing to pipeline. So the pipeline metric, what does that mean? And a lot of pipeline stuff can be fudged. Okay. But I'm also looking at what's the contribution per rep. Some people say, well, it's 3. I heard metrics as high as, $3 million a year. So if your inside sales dude is generating $3 million a year, okay, I'm paying him $250,000 a year, and I'll get as many as I can. The reality is that's top of funnel. That's top of funnel funny math. Okay. What does the conversion look like and everything else? And by the way, if the conversion's messed up, don't blame your inside guy. You also have to think, we're talking about inside, but you got to take a look at your outside processes as well. So that's going to become key. So that's another metric we're looking at. I see a lot of quality conversation QC metrics that come up. Oh, did you have a quality conversation where you got a meeting or something was disqualified? And that number is, can you get 4 a day? Can you get more than that? That all ends up depending. So these are things, and a couple more things that we have to think about from best practices. What's ramp? Okay. There's also ramp time. I mentioned on average, it's going to be about 3 months to get up to speed. Doesn't mean that, but the other thing is, when do they start calling? A lot of organizations, it may be a month. So do you have the right process in place? And then finally, once you've done all that, is and you've introduced, and again with the AI tools, hopefully attrition will go down. Ideally, it will if you're taking away the mundane tasks. But ultimately, is it affecting turnover? Turnover is just awful, and I think people underestimate the impact of turnover, whether it's inside or outside.
Well, thanks, Rob. This has been a great discussion. That's all the time we have for today, Rob. You survived the hot seat.
I did. It's cold here in New England. I could have really used the hot seat. No, thank you, guys.
If you in the audience, if you think you have what it takes to be in the hot seat, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. That is your In the Hot Seat episode for today. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Pete Smith.
And I'm Michael Fauscette. Tune in next time for different faces, different topics, and different perspectives as we put someone else in the hot seat.